I worked in a company called the Sheffield Metal Company, and I was a labourer, and I had to cart steel and metal and knives and forks.
I worked in two, a car parts factory and a paint factory.
I worked in a factory that printed newspapers. I'd just be in there all night doing repetitive work and hearing this overwhelming sound of a giant machine. It was very, very loud. Most people, it drove them crazy. Me, I was just thinking it was like easy listening in the background. It blanked all the thoughts out of my mind. I loved it.
My experience in childhood was lots of derelict factories in Manchester, empty cotton mills and so on. Steam engines being cut up for scrap.
There was still enough industrial activity to hear drop hammers going on all through the night.
Dans notre univers à tous, ce bruit existait déjà. Il était dans les aiguillages de locomotives qui passaient sur un passage à niveau, dans les machines-outils des usines.
The old industries were closed down and there was just a lot of waste ground. All the docks were empty and deserted and basically left to decay and rot. We'd either go into the factories or along the scrapyards to get our instrumentation, so for sure it informed us.
We slotted into those empty spaces and the gaps that were left by an industrial city, and the sounds that we made were sounds that evolved and emerged after the sounds of industry.
It's just a result of our life experiences, the sounds that you hear, those sounds that express how you feel.
These days we talk about the notion of psychogeography and how the environment affects the mood and behaviour of individuals. We all came from very working class background. It was embedded in our psyche and the way that we were brought up.
People say to me before, you work in a factory, then you go home and you make the same music and noise that you heard in the factory, don't you get bored with listening to it all day? And it's like, no.
The sounds of the factories and the steelworks there were subconscious and what they evolved into. It's always there, even though you don't know it.
Part of it was that, is there a way to make music that reflects our experience, including scrapping steam engines and wrecked buildings, the decay of industrial wealth into poverty and chaos.
The story I'm about to tell you is one of the most extraordinary tales of our time. It's a story of change, a change which has affected all of us. Some say it's a change for the worse. Others find it a change that is very exciting.
I've published the Industrial Culture Handbook, launching and promulgating industrial music.
The surrealists, or the situationists, or the Dadaists, or the futurists, you'd have a group of like-minded artists who would get together and decide that they're going to have an art movement and hammer out a name for it. The industrial one didn't work that way.
Probably Bristol got their label, Industrial Records, industrial music for industrial people. So the term industrial had started to sort of emerge.
L'intérêt principal n'était pas dans le domaine musical, c'était plutôt dans le domaine des idées, des concepts, de la philosophie.
It was about all forms of art, a certain transgressive noise aesthetic.
Images, information, the macabre, whatever anybody's little strange fantasies were.
La référence à toute la part noire de l'humanité, les meurtriers, la pornographie, etc.
C'était délibérément une façon de secouer le bourgeois et de lui dire mais réveille-toi un petit peu.
Being explicitly critical and had a political angle to it, this rejection of a mainstream consumer culture.
That whole idea of outsider art has become much more endemic everywhere in the world. It enabled millions of people who otherwise would never have become musicians or artists to make really strong contributions to the world of art.
This was influencing an entire generation. Not only for noise artists, it was an influence for all of electronic artists. There is industrial music in every kind of music, even top 10 productions.
It basically showed how aggressive noise elements can become part of popular culture, popular music, popular film, video, everything, everywhere.
My very early memory of music has got an odd electronic twist to it. I remember listening to a piece of music when I was about 6 years old. It's called Sparky's Magic Piano. It's quite a surreal and disturbing piece of music with a vocoded voice to it.
The radiophonic workshop were having things on the radio, and then there was Doctor Who and all these strange sounds. It was a very good period for that sort of experimental sounds and synths and things to come across.
Space Patrol had electronic noises rather than an actual musical thing to it, and I think that's what fascinated us when we were children, where you just get lots of drones and white noise as sound effects for a children's TV programme. It was totally different from anything else that we'd heard.
Movies like Halloween with the music from John Carpenter and Graham Revell from SPK.
I would save up every penny I could and travel to Melbourne, Australia every year and go to one record shop which had all the great imports. There I discovered great stuff like Kraftwerk, Kahn, Neu, Faust.
I bought that Faust record that Virgin Records brought out for 50p in 1970 or whatever it was. I loved it. I thought it was great. Absolutely brilliant. Sound of a mechanical saw, angle grinders and stuff like that. And that's what you need. You need to just be exposed to this stuff when you're of a certain age.
If you've got Kahn, Tego Mago on the back of that mentions Stockhausen, so you start investigating Stockhausen. And then from there you hear everybody else that's in that same genre.
John Peel played this amazing track by this band, the Velvet Underground, and it had electric viola on it.
There was a huge amount of experimentation came out of the 60s. Everything was possible. It was still in the air in the 70s.
Kraftwerk was probably one of the first really pure electronic pieces I've heard. This was a new universe.
I discovered the band called Suicide from New York, and this opens a complete new world for me.
The elements that were influencing us were just underground elements from around the world.
Dans la musique industrielle, ce qui est intéressant d'ailleurs aussi à l'époque, c'est que la plupart étaient quand même tous innés d'une grande culture musicale. Une culture générale d'ailleurs, pas que musicale, beaucoup plus ouverte et beaucoup plus riche que bon nombre d'artistes, musiciens et plasticiens. C'était des gens qui lisaient beaucoup, il y avait une approche vraiment très ouverte sur le monde de l'art et puis surtout sur le monde en général, puisqu'il y avait cette contestation qui était due à une portée politique, donc il y avait quelque chose de concerné par rapport à la civilisation, à la société et l'approche qu'on en avait.
Dada emerged in Switzerland during the First World War. It was a reaction to the atrocity that was happening. A lot of what they were doing in their performance and stuff was based on a certain relationship to absurdity, to elevate absurdity and give it a more human manifestation than the inhuman absurdity of the war.
To make a Dadaist poem, take a newspaper, take a pair of scissors. Choose an article as long as you are planning to make your poem. Cut out the article. Then cut out each of the words that make up the article and place in a bag. Shake gently. Then take out each of the scraps, one after the other, in the order in which they left the bag. Copy conscientiously. The poem will be like you. And here you are, a writer.
We had a mindset at that time that was quite iconoclastic and wanting to sort of go against the rules and wanting to confront a lot of the accepted norms, and so it sort of resonated with us, that idea of challenging it, partly through a prankster mentality. I think it was the mischievousness that existed in Dada that was interesting to us from an art movement.
It was an influence on me in terms of its stance. It was like an anti-stance. I like the outsider artists of that period.
We were post-war babies, if you like, post-Second World War babies. The culture changed completely from just conforming and getting a job and getting married and having children and then doing it all again. Everybody wanted to go out and discover different things. When everyone knew about Dali and Warhol and people like that, they had an impact on what was possible in life.
La Beat Generation a amené un contre-pouvoir par rapport à une littérature établie et une vision justement de la littérature et du monde.
Brian Geisen contributed to the idea of Cut Up, the Dream Machine, and William Burroughs took those ideas and went with them in his fiction.
In 1964, I read Naked Lunch for the first time. The whole notion of cut up got integrated.
Now, these experiments started not on tape recorders, but on paper. In 1959, Brian Geisen said that writing is 50 years behind painting, and applied the montage technique to words on a page. Brian copied out phrases from newspapers and magazines, then took his scissors and cut these selections into pieces and rearranged the fragments at random.
Genesis P.O. brought those things into the forefront of people's perception. I remember reading a magazine called Performance where he mentions all these things, Burroughs and Geisen.
We came across the cut-ups after we discovered William Burroughs and Brian Geisen, and although there were books that had examples of literature and poetry cut up, there weren't really any examples of what their tape recorder experiments actually sounded like. We began to try and experiment with tape recorders, 1 or 2 tape recorders and radio and reading at the same time.
It was a process that really translated very well to music and sound, particularly when you're using analog tape, and so you cut those sounds up and find new meanings from what you've done. It worked lyrically, it worked musically. It worked as an interesting process and experiment to find different meanings, different kind of contexts in what you're doing.
The 2 books that I read early on that were phenomenally influential were Crash and The Atrocity Exhibition.
One of the most prophetic, visionary, incredible, poetic works of the 20th century, and definitely one of my totally favorite authors of all time.
In slow motion, the test cars move towards each other on collision courses, unwinding behind them the coils that ran to the devices by the impact zone. As they collided, the debris of wings and fender floated into the air. The cars rocked against each other as they continued on their disintegrating courses.
Tout ce qui était vraiment à l'encontre d'un système bourgeois établi ne pouvait que foncer dans le mou de tout ça, de toute façon, c'était une évidence.
On n'avait pas Internet, mais il y avait beaucoup d'échanges par le biais des lettres. Je savais pas que c'était du mail art, mais j'en faisais de façon spontanée. Il y avait tout un réseau déjà qui existait, avec énormément d'échanges. Genesis était en relation avec Cabaret Voltaire, avec Expliqué, avec Vel de Research, Bob Dries de Nom, etc.
One of the most interesting people I discovered through the mail was Genesis P. Orridge, who sent some very complicated letter to me, mail art, researching the completely darker side of history and culture and being a big William Burroughs fan.
Fell into touch with a group of people who would later become the founders of industrial music. I was in contact very early on with Zeb, and I was in contact very, very early on with Genesis P. Orridge. And I was also in touch with Richard H. Kirk from Cabaret Voltaire because of our mutual interest in Dadaism. And they were in these magazines that dealt with mail art, where people in Europe would have gallery shows and they would essentially put up any piece of art that somebody mailed them. And somehow my name got on a list and I began receiving bizarre art from all over the world.
I did the magazine, The Gun Rubber. That was really just a fanzine, just to promote the ideas and the music.
J'ai fait un premier fanzine de science-fiction qui s'appelait One Shot, et le numéro 2 s'est intéressé aux musiques qui sortaient à cette époque-là et a introduit un nouveau titre, Sordide Sentimentale. Je parlais de musique dont personne ne parlait à l'époque. Il y avait déjà des articles sur Throbbing Gristle. Quand il a été question de sortir un disque, ça me paraissait évident qu'il fallait le faire avec eux, parce que parmi tous les groupes avec lesquels on était en contact, c'était le plus radical, celui qui était le plus en rupture, non seulement par rapport à la société, mais même par rapport au rock'n'roll. Les fanzines, pour moi, n'étaient pas un moyen, mais un but. Pour la plupart des gens, faire un fanzine, ça voulait dire ouvrir une porte vers devenir professionnel. Alors que moi, j'ai toujours voulu rester amateur.
Punk made people feel like they could do it themselves.
The punk music scene started around about 76, 77. And in 1978, I got involved in an alternative music scene that was called the Now Society. And then I decided to actually do something myself. Because it was a period when you could do that, when it wasn't about musical proficiency, it was just about wanting to do something.
We weren't anything to do with punk in terms of the type of music that we played, but it was a pivotal moment for us because it opened a lot of doors. People's attitude was changing. The spirit that went with it was more important than the actual format it took.
Industrial music came from that period as a kind of DIY ethos.
Karl Marx said economics determines life, and if you have no money, you have no choice but to do everything yourself as much as possible.
If you want to make a record, you could, and that was where the culture became really interesting because suddenly you were designing your own record covers, so you had a say in everything you do. It comes up in conversation, oh, you were in a band, and people step back in awe. And I was thinking, well, why? I wasn't particularly gifted as a musician. I just had a desire to do something.
I played some of my music on the radio, and Zeb had heard it. And he said, do you ever think of putting out a record? I said, I'd love to put out a record, but who in their right mind would release a record of my music? He said, no. You can release your own record. You can give them some money, they'll make copies of your record, and there are all these avant-garde distribution centers that will send it out to galleries and places that would sell it.
Genesis and I used to hire a van. We used to go to the factory, pick up the pressings and drive around record stores in London delivering them ourselves initially. Tried to do as much of what we could ourselves and be as self-sufficient as we could. Put our own gigs on, do our own distribution, get everything pressed ourselves, and avoid working with major labels, major channels.
The way that we approach culture is if something should be done, we feel that it's our duty to try and do it. Whether we have the skills or the equipment or whatever, we still should try and make something.
It was always important to us to control our own product and how we were perceived. Most people's attitude was if you wanted to make music or you wanted to succeed, then you had to lease yourself out to a major label.
A lot of the people in the past that we met in the business were interested in how much money they could make out of you, and that was about it. They didn't care really about the music. They end up by dictating what you can and can't do, so to remain independent as far as we're concerned is a much better idea.
We went to Virgin and Stiff just out of curiosity and fun to see what would happen. From those conversations that we had, it got us interested in thinking we could do it ourselves. Creating our own logo, all that kind of thing was something that we enjoyed doing, playing with the music industry, the advertising industry, the music press. It was something that we wanted to break down and demystify and bring back to people to have control over their own work. Robert Rental and Thomas Lear came to us about their album and we said we'd love to put it out. That was another fun aspect when you sit down and think, oh, we could have another band.
I was given an electronics kit when I was very young, probably 8 or 9, and I built a crystal radio and things like that. Practical Electronics used to publish these circuits. One of them was a basic synthesizer and then with like guitar effects pedals. So I built some of these circuits. The sounds that came out just fascinated me.
My father bought me a tape recorder. I started recording onto it straight away. He gave me the mic and showed me how to do it. He was into electronics and he used to make radios and all kinds of things. So I was used to all these weird kind of sounds going on in the house.
I used to have quite a big synthesizer that I built, similar to a Moog, one that was like an ARP. Everything we had was either custom built or that I built.
I had a friend who loaned me his synthesizer that he'd got from England. It was called an EMS AKS. It didn't really have a keyboard. It was just almost like an old-fashioned telephone exchange where you had like little pins that you plugged in and you connected oscillators to filters and so on.
We just used old tape recorders and a synth that Chris had made himself. The idea of being purely electronic was never that appealing. We liked the idea of having a guitar or a bass because it was a bit of a nod of the head to the funk influences, to the Velvet Underground influences.
J'avais fait construire des énormes percussions en métal que j'avais fait fabriquer dans une usine.
We'd take anything we could find, sheets of corrugated iron, water tanks taken from houses and factories, sheets of metal, petrol tanks.
The debris from society, really.
We would make instruments. We had the arms of all the turntable that we connected to a jack so we could use the needle as a contact mic. I mean, it was seriously dangerous because of the volume it could create. Now we'd use things like electric razors over my guitar.
We had no professional musical background. In fact, we always believed musical training was just the worst thing you could have because it then immediately imposed on you sort of regulated or rule-based view of how music should be. When you didn't have that, we were free to do whatever we want.
With TG, one of the ideas was it should be people who could not play their instruments so that they weren't trapped into riffs and traditions and looking backwards at the way music was made.
I've never had any musical training. In fact, I still have to write on the keys on my keyboard what the notes are because I just have this musical dyslexia.
We were using classical sampling loops before samplers were even invented.
We've been sampling since the 80s. We sample a lot of our own stuff. We used to sample a lot from films and TV.
Everything could be included. Likewise, the music, television sounds, sleazes, samples and tape recordings. We absolutely liberated the idea of what music could contain.
Industrial music is working with the noises and the sounds of the environment integrated in the technology.
If I heard a sound that I liked, I would record it, I would take it home, I would make it somehow into a loop, and then I created a machine where I could manipulate these various noises. There was no such technology, and I had to be more creative as a result.
I was working in the harbor, loading and unloading ships. And sometimes when ships came in from a rough sea in wintertime and the complete deck was frozen, when they opened it, it made such a screaming noise. I said, next time I have to bring a tape recorder, I have to record this noise. And so all those things we integrate in the music.
I never get tired of recording, especially when we get new software, new equipment or anything that suddenly inspires you all over again, triggers off new ideas. I'm no way thinking of ever so-called retiring. Maybe not doing live work, but never stop recording. I don't think I could.
What keeps me going forward is creating new sounds. I'm always thinking of sound. I mean, I go to bed at night and lie there thinking of ways I can patch my modular system to try a new sound. And I can't hear that sound, but I can imagine what it might sound like. And then part of the excitement is coming back in the studio the next day, patching it how I imagined it and seeing what sort of sound that makes. And there's always going to be that excitement, I think, with me. We started just before punk, and then by the time we started doing gigs, punk was really taking off. And a name like Throbbing Gristle, it even sounds like a punk band. And people were turning up at pubs and clubs that we were playing at. I'm sure they were expecting to find a punk band, and I felt sorry for them in a way because they just got these four crazy people doing experimental music.
Something came over me, something came over me, and I don't know what it was. No, I don't know what it was. Or was it white and sticky? Or was it white and sticky? Well, I don't know what it was. No, I don't know what it was.
We played in about 1975, which was a time that wasn't ready for the weird kind of stuff we were doing, so that ended up in a bit of a riot.
We had a lot of animosity. There was a lot of violence at the early gigs, people throwing things at us, booing us off stage, cutting the power, anything to get us off.
The way we set the band up originally was Derek would be on one side, I'd be on the other side, and there'd be a tape recorder rolling in the middle, so people would know. We weren't trying to hide it. This is what we do, this is the only way we can get it across to you. Get the odd occasional sarcastic remark.
It's all on tier.
Yeah.
We had things like brilliant white lights, halogen lamps at the back of us facing the audience, and then behind that we had these massive screens that were highly reflective. They were just like mirrors, and we had a bank of those behind us, so when people came in to see us, before we even got on stage, all they could see were themselves looking at the stage.
We were described by Kevin Murphy of Sounds. They said our first gig in London looked like a bombed department store because there was so much equipment sprawled around. There was gas canisters, there was all sorts on the stage. It was almost like a sensory overload.
SPK, along with the other bands, were very visual. Angle grinders and power tools, but videos before that with a lot of forensic imagery that at that time people had never encountered.
When we first did the concert in Deptford with the South Wales Striking Miners Choir, there was these group of old ladies and they were standing right at the front of the stage. And we had like massive, huge, you wouldn't believe the size of tanks, and we were hitting with sledgehammers. It was the first concert they'd actually been able to hear anything that they ever, because they were stone deaf, so they could feel it physically and they could hear it.
Women have said that it has given them orgasms. People have said that they had LSD flashbacks, and one person told me that it jarred a filling out of the tooth in their head.
We initially tried to replicate the live element and atmosphere and energy on record, but we couldn't duplicate that feeling.
A real physical effect too, of loud, hypnotic rhythm and noise that would take you out of an everyday way of thinking and feeling.
Live performance was a really fun part of what we did. A lot of these bands, in fact, were more interesting live than they are on record. There's a number of reasons for that. One of the first ones is we're using really extreme sound sources, which it's very hard to get through microphones unless you're in a studio environment, and even then you're not going to get it.
Noise on record doesn't translate as well. Live, you can take it to the next level.
When I look back, I feel quite proud in terms of what then developed from the early 80s. What we were doing live was definitely a precursor to the rave culture.
The 3-day week in Britain and the miners' strike, Margaret Thatcher, the chaos, the unemployment level went up to 20-something%. Yeah, well, of course you're aware of that. I was on the dole too.
There were streets and streets of Victorian houses that had been left empty, waiting to be demolished for new boxes to be put in their place. So the atmosphere was definitely one of decline and disintegration.
It was just the landscape, the environment in which we were working.
The idea of the austerity that went on in that early 80s period is part of a myth. It's too easy to buy into the grimness of it. I think there was a lot of fun, a lot of excitement and a lot of things going on around that time, as well as the dysfunctional nature of what Margaret Thatcher's government were doing to manufacturing, to youth, to the whole cultural backdrop of this country.
The first incarnation of TG were political. You couldn't help it in the 70s.
There was a political intention from the beginning. That developed due to events within Britain that politicised us, Thatcher coming into power.
We were against the government at the time. There's a lot of stuff that is still resented now and will be for some time that government did.
It had such an impact on what we did, where we lived, who we were, the politics and Thatcher and all that whole era.
It was all around us. We were from that area. The miners' strike was important.
The country was basically put into a police state for a while because of the miners' strike. We had an experience with that. We're going on tour, we had to get to Harwich. Our journey took us across county boundaries. We got stopped by 3 police forces who didn't believe we were going to Harwich. They thought that we were a van full of pickets. That brought it home to us that it was not a free country.
At the time, it was like a virtual civil war. You had to put yourself out there and get involved with people.
This policeman come running at me. I dived flat on the ground. I was dragged off to this van.
Musicians and bands were very supportive and very sympathetic to what was going on. Margaret Thatcher was very instrumental in what was happening to all of us, and so there was solidarity.
We decided to approach the South Wales choirs to raise money for the striking miners. We went on a tour around the country doing benefits, playing in mining communities.
A friend of ours made the film For Enemy Within, the Keith LeBlanc track that came out was in support of the miners. We were very conscious of it and very supportive of it.
I did some solo projects in the 70s. It was me on stage with a self-built synthesizer.
We went to see his show and then he came down to Martello Street and we did some jam sessions.
They were very acoustic based when I met them. He had a drum kit and an organ and a guitar.
We started Coombe Transmissions originally as a sort of ad hoc improvising band with 2 violins and tablas and bongos and stuff.
And then when I came, I brought my electronics along. And this was just at the crossover point where Coombe was finishing and they were wondering what to do after Coombe.
We were living in Hull and I was listening to all the local slang. And one of the phrases we heard was throbbing gristle.
TG just began as 4 people sitting around talking about, wouldn't it be fun if we did this? Because we're all interested in the same goals in life in some ways. And we can bring different things to the whole melting pot. All 4 of us were so strong that when you bring the 4 together, there's bound to be some explosive result.
We got the logo of the lightning bolt and the anarchist flag. And I was saying to Monty, it needs a name for this to work, for us to insert this into popular culture and it have any chance of working. So we were talking away and throwing things at Monty, and one moment he goes, Jen, you keep saying industrial. It's industrial music. Industrial music for industrial people.
We need some discipline here. Discipline. We need some discipline here.
When we first did second annual report, we had just enough money to press something like 790 copies. And I guessed it would take maybe 2 years to sell them all. But we gave one to Sandy Robertson at Sounds, and I gave one to John Savage at Melody Maker, and they both gave it 5-star rave reviews. And we suddenly started getting phone calls from Virgin Megastore and Rough Trade saying, how do we get copies of this album?
We were making music that we wanted to make for ourselves, ultimately. We didn't court success. We didn't want to be successful. We were serious about what we were doing, but we had like a safety net of a day job. I said that I wanted to leave the band just before we went to America on the last tour, and I said that it would be the last thing I did with Throbbing Gristle.
Officially it was 81, the last gig in America, but I'd already left Genesis in 79.
If I hadn't have done that, if for some other reason we'd stayed together, I think we could have been relatively successful then.
We were happy to move on and do something different that we'd never ever done before.
Chris and Cozy started as TG were ending. There was an overlap of about 6 months. We were recording some of the first Chris and Cozy album, Heartbeat, in Los Angeles in 1981, and then Rough Trade released it. We did the whole Chris and Cozy thing through the 80s and 90s. I mean, we did some massive tours, signed to some really good labels, Play It Again, Sam Wax Tracks Network.
Come in.
He is the father of fear, the muscle of sin. He is the father of fear.
Psychic TV had to be something totally different. The first thing was that everybody could play, except me. Real musicians exploring more traditional forms of music and seeing if they could still be mutated, evolved, pushed, contain hidden surprises. It's been fascinating. We've done ballet and film and reggae and blues and pop music and acid house, techno, you name the 4. We've explored it.
We regrouped in 2003. It took us a few years to re-establish contact with everyone.
Daniel Miller approached us from Mute and said, would you want to put out Digi-24 box set? So we said, yeah, okay. That's when we realised how successful Throbbing Gristle was, because we were playing to thousands of people, playing big festivals and selling 10 times as many records as we were when we were together the first time.
We regrouped for 10 years. Genesis walked out on the shows we were doing in 2010, and shortly after, Sleazy died, so that was the end of TG altogether.
In '73 we were in a loft with old tape recorders and bits and pieces of instruments and microphones, making sounds that didn't bear any relationship to normal structures that people used. Everything from unstructured noise, cacophonous noise, to sort of melodic, beautiful stuff. We always tried to make something that captured the sound of the city we lived in, those sonic moments that we were all surrounded by. Journalists really were a gateway into a bigger world of music. We put a few tracks together, like Duke Mussolini and Jeff Travis licensed a few tracks. We were an English electronic band that wanted to release something at a time when Rough Trade were in a position to actually bring an independent record out. We brought records out with Rough Trade, we brought records out with Factory. We did quite a number of albums. We were quite prolific.
Small record companies have always taken risks on music that is not commercial. This music has no obvious audience, but Rough Trade ignore record company wisdom about what people want to hear.
Sheffield was a place of declining industry. There was little workshops where people could take over and start to rehearse in. Strangely, Margaret Thatcher didn't intend it that way, but it opened up a whole culture of people being able to make music, but also be on the edge of start of making their own way. We'd gone from being what we thought were the only people doing anything out of the ordinary in the mid-70s to 3 years later, a whole burgeoning of a scene. Club DVA, Hula, lots of bands started to emerge at that time.
Time for movement, time for market, time for myself, time for disco.
The studio we had, Western Works, was very central to what we did. We did all kinds of stuff in there, from 23 Skidoo to Lydia Lunch, Adrian Sherwood. I've done stuff with Africa Bambaataa. We've worked with some great people. By about 1983, it had radically changed from being in a tiny attic with 3 people crouching under a roof, making tape loops and weird noises, to 2 people playing in different parts of the world with more state-of-the-art equipment.
Another smile while way back home, someone travels down to shop for lines to juggle signs, spinning over, over and over, spinning over, over and over.
My name is Boyd Bryce. I began doing noise music in the mid-70s. I was making paintings, creating things that looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. I was doing experimental photography, and ultimately I thought I can apply these same ideas to sound. My first album just came with a black cover. It had no name, no nothing. But you'd open it up and it'd say Boyd Bryce, and it would have 4 different speeds, 16, 33, 45, 78. So you could play it at 4 different speeds. Then I did Pagan Muzak, 45 7-inch with 17 circular grooves on it. So you can put in the needle and it will just play until you take the needle out. There were some annoying neighbors a girl had. We put the needle and just turned it up all the way and went up to a cabin in the mountains for the weekend. The neighbors were on their best behavior forever after. Lydia Lunch said, I play noise because I want to torture my audience. And I thought, that's exactly the opposite of what I want to do. I want to create something that takes it to another level. I really did like noise. I thought noise was great, and that the noisier, the better. That, for me, was what I thought music should be. It should just be minimalist and powerful, and it should energize you. Music world was kind of opening up, and somebody like me who a few years before, if I'd gone to a club and say, here's a tape of what I want to do, please put on a show by me, they would have just said, you're insane, don't ever come around here again. But by the time I was in a position where I could tour and travel around the United States and do shows, it was just wide open, I could do anything. Went to England May 1978, and I had a bunch of copies of my Black album. And I went to Rough Trade to see if I could sell them some. And they liked it, and they wanted to buy all of them. The girl behind the counter at Rough Trade played me anything she thought I might like. The thing that I liked was Warm Leatherette and TVOD by Daniel Miller, so I bought that. And I was just about to leave, and Daniel comes in. So we started talking, and we had a lot in common. We hit it off. He said, boy, what do the numbers on your record label? And I said, well, what do you think they mean? He said, let's see if I got this right. 1916 was the start of Dadaism. 1933, Hitler came to power. 1945 was the end of World War II, and 1978 is now. And I said, wow, that's really good. They actually, though, just represent the speeds on a record player. And before I was about to leave England, he said, you know, my record's doing really well, and if it continues to do well, I might start my own record company. He said, if I do that, would it be okay if I re-released your Black album? And I said, yeah, of course. Ultimately, that happened. Meeting him changed my entire life. I'm still with you.
While I was working at the mental asylum in Sydney, Australia, I met a guy called Stephen Hill, and we became good friends and we began SBK together. He had been both a patient at the hospital and also a nurse, and I became a nurse at the asylum.
One by one, up to even, bring the scene through the ink, blood red rhythm dips away, aching to inject its blade, know that fresh destroy on you, the counter blocks between us few, put together, pull apart, finish the machining heart. The counter big romantic, leading images identical, disembodied industry, one more ghost humanity.
When I first went to Europe in 1979, I had already heard Throbbing Gristle, Second Annual Report, which I thought was a fantastic piece of music. I was also very interested in the thought processes around the band. They were talking about obscurity and burrow and a lot of things that indicated to me that they were very intelligent people. We were fortunate to be one of the ones that he decided would be worthwhile putting on Industrial Records. I was really thinking I was going to be a writer at that time, so I started to go to lectures of philosophers and thinkers at the time, Deleuze, Baudrillard, Foucault. We're sitting here on the edge of an epistemological break, which is Foucault's term. The world just became digital, and all this information is just becoming an enormous smash. That was the prime reason I started SPK.
Exile in the battlefield.
My favorite work from that period is really Zami Limani, the Songs of Byzantine Flowers. Just gave me an opportunity to bring all the things that I love about music and also poetry and Gaudi's architecture and everything into the one place. Finding that it was Single of the Week with NME and Melody Maker is extraordinary, because you're at that time talking about big bands. Some people in LA heard the movie and that became my career from then on. It's a great career to be able to put on a new hat and be this other kind of musician. Sometimes you see movies like Sin City and Blow. I did a film called The Crow, which has Tuvan music, it has Armenian music, it has jazz, it has rock and roll, it has industrial, it has everything. That's just an example of how industrial music has really come a long way. It really is all the world of music, but it's a way of putting it together that defines it. It can be dark and it can be violent, but still beautiful at the same time.
Since its inception in the late 70s, industrial music has come a long way from its origins as an obscure, extreme and taboo movement of passionate and creative DIY artists and musicians. What started as a rejection of major labels, mass media and popular culture has in fact gone on to influence positive change in all these areas. Today, industrial music can be heard everywhere, taking root in popular music, popular culture, and Hollywood film scores. Industrial music and culture has and will continue to influence generations of artists, filmmakers, labels, and musicians. Industrial music founders continue to push the boundaries of sound and stay true to the DIY ethos of industrial music.
this vital fluid. In the oceans of the moon, swimming squid-like and squalid, this bright moon is a liquid. The dark earth is a solid.